Spinward Fringe Broadcast 1 Resurrection. Written by Randolph Lalonde. Narrated by Adam Verner. Prologue. It was a rebirth. Under the flickering lights of the cold cargo hold, two women played at midwifery. Between them stood a scratched and dented stasis pod. The tall one with the long brown hair entered a combination into the control panel on its side. The shorter woman waited, standing ready with a breathing device in hand. The dark pod opened at the bottom. Thick fluid burst forth, carrying an unconscious man out onto the deck. "Hurry, get the pump in," said the taller of the two. Just as the man was beginning to gag, choke, and gurgle, the shorter of the pair bent down and expertly inserted the breathing apparatus. It began to extract the liquid in his lungs while she held it to his mouth, keeping him from spitting it out. The content of his stomach came up as well. It joined the puddle of life-preserving fluid spreading across the floor. He began to thrash. His fit of writhing and retching was an unconscious thing, a result of his sudden extraction. "Hold his arms, Alice. We don't want him hurting himself, poor man." At her counterpart's urging, she did what was asked, kneeling down, taking a firm grip of his wrists. "Good thing he's still sedated. This is no picnic." "Was it like this for you?" asked the more stout of the pair. "It was," Alice replied. "Only I was awake the entire time. The system used the emergency pump to help me expel some of this gunk. I didn't understand how my body worked when the ejection system dropped me. He'll be better off." "Do you think he'll remember anything from before they put him in?" "The system log said they wiped him. His memories are gone. His skills and what they programmed into him are all there, though. He'll make his way until we can circle back around for him," Alice said. It was as much a wish and a promise as it was a statement. "What did they program him with? Did you get a chance to see?" "Combat skills, survival, medical treatment methods for all known races, a huge object and location database, and some kind of persistent employment directive. The personality they set him up with is pretty featureless. I don't know what he'll become. It's like they wanted him to work for them, or anyone, really, but be some kind of leader, too. If it sticks, he'll never be able to function unless he has some kind of employer, at least a temporary one." "That sounds like android programming," Alice's companion said, shaking her head. "What jobs do you think he'll want?" "Anything, from waste management to CEO to hitman. He'll go crazy if he's unemployed for long. The only way to break it is serious psychological trauma. I really don't like leaving him alone, Bernice." "Don't worry. He should fit right into this sector," Bernice replied. "I can't believe we made it. The sentient rights laws here are perfect for refugees like him," Alice said with a sigh. "And you," added Alice's companion. "Too bad we have to move on. Hopefully we'll be back here before he's had much of a chance to settle in. The company even changed his name." "To what?" Bernice asked. "Jacob Valance." "That's awfully close to his real one," Bernice said, shaking her head. "If they didn't do a good wipe on him, he could start recalling things, don't you think?" "Maybe they're not sure if they got everything," Alice replied. "He'll accept it more easily if it's near what he grew up with. I wish we had time to find out what they had planned for him. All this preparation had to be for something," Alice said as she stood up. "He's clear. Pull out the breather, Bernice." The mouthpiece was carefully removed, and Alice put a blanket around him with great care. She knelt down and gently wiped the thick stasis fluid off his sleeping face. "I wish I could do more for you, Dad. I wish I could stay and help you make sense of it all, remind you of what you're missing, where you should be, but they're after me. They'll be after you, too, if we don't leave you here," she whispered. "I promise I'll come back for you when I get some breathing room." "We have to go, dear. I'm so sorry," Bernice said as she closed the doors to the stasis pod and activated the small anti-gravity drive on the bottom. It hovered up from the deck as she started leading it to the airlock. "I know. Alice replied quietly, as she stood and wiped away a tear. God, this is wrong. But it's the only way for him to be safe. If they find him with us, they'll kill him. Or worse. She dropped a backpack off her shoulder as she looked around the cargo bay, shaking her head. She followed behind Bernice, and a moment later, the airlock sealed. The rattling and creaking of the docking mechanism, holding the smaller ship to Jacob Valance's new home, announced his daughter's departure. The vessel carrying the two women away jettisoned the empty stasis chamber. It cracked and twisted in the near-instant freeze of space, before a small anti-fighter shell blew it into 1,000,000 pieces. It would transmit the status of its contents no longer, and as the small, nondescript long-range shuttle escaped into hyperspace, the larger, older ship drifted just on the edge of an asteroid belt, waiting for her new captain to rouse from his long slumber. Chapter 1. 5 years later. Lacent 3 was its usual brooding self. Planets have moods, temperaments. Lacent 3 was always dark and cold, with gray rolling clouds that barely yielded rain, and the 11-degree temperature. It was anything but comfortable for human habitation. As the small crew of 5 made their way up the empty main street of Second Fall, a small port town with nothing but dry, hard-packed ground for miles around, they shielded their faces and exposed skin against the fine sand whirling around. The air was gray. The ground was gray. The features of the steel buildings glinted in the minimal light. Any paint or decoration had eroded away long ago under the constant abrasion of coarse airborne particles. The day was only a little brighter than night, but it was 20 degrees warmer. Twilight drove everyone indoors, including the group of 5 that had no idea they were being watched. The Gallows Hall was the biggest and best tavern on the planet, and it was the only place they wanted to be. It was 6 stories tall, and for a price, provided lodgings to travelers who wanted a little time away from their ships, or were just too intoxicated to remember where they landed. "I can't wait to get inside and just crawl into a bottle of hot Mishnakel," one of the crew said. He was a shorter fellow who didn't bother with his headgear, but tried to shield his face from the sand with his hands instead. "That stuff'll rot your brain. Besides, I don't see the point in drinking something that causes memory loss more than 70% of the time. I'm here to make good memories. That's what liberty's all about," a young woman walking in front of him replied. She was one of the practical ones in the group. She wore her entire protective bodysuit. "You think we'll have a good time? Here? Have you seen where we landed?" asked a young man who had carried his headgear under his arm. "Now I understand why the captain stayed aboard the ship. There's nothing to get excited about," said another fellow who shielded his face with his upraised arm. "He stayed aboard ship to finish the trade. We're lucky we got off. Otherwise, we'd be transporting phosphoric acid for a couple hours," said the one at the rear, the other woman in the group, who wore her vac suit headpiece as well. It had a transparent face and fit closely to her head. "Driving a hover truck through this mess at 200 clicks an hour with a load of acid isn't my idea of fun. Why would anyone want so much of that stuff anyway? It's bloody dangerous. Can't make that stuff on this rock. And that stuff eats parts of a fabricator if you're stupid enough to try to convert materials into acid. Think about it." As they came within just a few meters of the paired doors leading into the tavern, a few patrons came lurching out. They were in environment suits, some close-fitting, others more protective and utilitarian. They looked like a mixed bunch, but definitely from the same crew. They were stumbling about, a few of them leaning against each other. "Oh, God, I hate this planet," said one. "Is it supposed to burn?" said another gruff fellow with a thick Irish Union accent as he staggered a few steps, bottle in hand. "Let's get back to the ship," said his companion. The crew on their way into the bar hesitated for a moment, waiting for the 9 patrons to get out of the way. Without warning, the stumbling, bottle-toting patron staggered right towards them. "Hey, Captain doesn't let booze on board. Want the rest of this?" he asked, holding out the half-full bottle as he fell into one of the approaching crew. 2 of them caught him, and a third took the bottle. "Judging from what it's done to you, I think I'll pass," one of them said, handling it by the neck with 2 fingers. "Back on your feet, guy," the larger of the crew said as he walked the intoxicated fellow back to his friends, who were slowly starting to walk away from the door. A pair of them each took an arm and started guiding him down the street. They watched the ragtag crew make their way down the abandoned walkway for a moment, then started through the doors. "Wait, where's Jillian?" asked the woman at the head of the group. The other 3 looked around and didn't see the woman who was walking at the rear last they looked. "Jillian!" one of the men called out. "They must have taken her," said another fellow, drawing his long pistol. He ran down the street to the nearest corner, where he could see one of the patrons just walking out of sight. "Wait!" said another man as he ran after his friend. He was several meters behind, but close enough to see the flashes of light from the alleyway, as his friend was shot several times. He stopped, unsure of himself. The 2 other crew members stopped behind him. "What do we do?" "We wait, and then we pick up Curtis's corpse and bring it back to the ship," the other fellow said, checking the crew status readout on his wrist. One light had gone out. "We didn't see them take her. Whoever did it must be around here somewhere," retorted the last remaining woman in the group. "If those folks were the distraction, I don't want to see the main event," one of the crew members said. "What do you mean? We can't just—" "I mean whoever's got their hands on her are more dangerous, and I don't want to cross them," he insisted. "We can report them. There's a sheriff department here, and Jillian wasn't her real name. And our cargo is being sold off-book. We get on with our night, or we chase our tails until Captain Torres leaves us behind. Jillian's on her own." That was the end of it. Across the street, behind a small building, Jillian struggled with her wrist restraints. Her captor had come up behind without making a sound while she stood watching the stumbling revelers. He pressed one hand down on her sidearm, jamming it into its holster. He popped her helmet open, then pulled it off with an expert hand. Her captor held a weapon against her neck. "Don't say a word. Don't move, and you'll make it out of this alive," he whispered, dragging her backwards across the street at a run. He was strong, fast, and he knew exactly what he was doing. As soon as they got around the corner, he took her handgun out of its holster and put it inside his coat. She grabbed his arm and tried to flip him, but he dropped to his knees and punched her in the stomach so hard it knocked all the wind out of her. He tripped her, and she fell flat on her back. Before she knew it, she was in wrist restraints. "My license number is Valance 433-11482-213. I represent the Dormer Port Authority." "Bounty hunter?" she asked, trying to catch her breath. "Yes, they have you down for 1 count of attempted starship hijacking and 5 counts of murder." "Let me explain. That ship belonged to my brother. His crew wouldn't give it to me when he died." The bounty hunter pulled something out of his black long coat and rolled it out on the ground beside her. "You'll get a trial. There's real law where you're going." Jillian watched him open a slit in the long bag and redoubled her efforts, trying to get on her feet. "What are you doing?" she asked. "It's an emergency stasis bag. It'll protect you until I can get you into a real long-term tube," he said, as he firmly planted a hand on her chest and poised to inject her with something using a device on his wrist. "Please, don't do this. They'll kill me. Just let me go. I'll give you everything I have, anything you want," she pleaded as she looked up at his blackened, transparent steel faceplate. He was in a sealed black vac suit and black long coat. Everything about him was unyielding. This was only business to him. He brought the device on his left forearm up to her throat again, only this time the metal injector touched bare skin, and she winced in anticipation of whatever substance he was about to dose her with. There was a moment of hesitation. "I'm sorry. I'm under contract," he said, before she felt the injector's pinch. She slipped into unconsciousness as he rolled her into the vac bag. Chapter 2. Routine maintenance. The Samson hovered over the alleyway, blasting the shadows with the light of its thrusters, kicking up a whirlwind of dirt and dust. Captain Valance awaited below with a body in a stasis bag over his shoulder. Frost, the Samson's heavy-set tactical officer, dropped a harness from a hatch, and his captain wrapped his free arm in it. "Haul me up," he commanded. Frost activated the winch and pulled him up 10 stories and into the lower airlock. "Captain's in and we're clear to move on to the second pickup, Ashley," Frost reported. "Roger, moving on," replied a female voice with a slight lisp. "Should cause much trouble?" Frost asked the captain, regarding the stasis bag as he made sure the lower hatch was secure. "No more than I expected," Captain Valance replied, as he stepped onto the small lift plate that would elevate him out of the airlock and into the interior of the ship. "I'm going to get her into stasis. Pass my thanks on to the local sheriff here. Make sure he got his fee. Get the rest of the crew on board and set course for the THAAD system." "Aye, sir." "Did you manage to replace anyone while I was landside?" Captain Valance asked. "Aye, sir. 4 able crewmen signed on, all experienced, and an engineer with 3 years' schooling," said Frost. "Lucky. Does he have any experience?" "Just a few months on an old ore hauler. He's only 19. "Young? Well, take care of him. Make sure he has an opportunity to learn before we need him for anything important." "Aye, sir." "Oh, and Frost, after this capture is in stasis, I'll be in my quarters. No disturbances." Captain Valance's voice was flat, humorless. "Aye. Bad one, sir?" Frost asked, as he watched his captain reach the top of the airlock and step out. He didn't reply. "We're at the pickup point, Frost. They should be right below us," Ashley reported, her voice coming through the communicator stud in his pierced ear. "Aye, I see 'em," he replied, looking at the beat-up monitor in the airlock wall. "Opening up. Get ready to get out of here. We're headed straight on to THAAD." "Really? We getting leave?" she asked. "Don't think so. Pretty sure it's a job. Ask the captain later. He's in a mood," Frost replied, saying the last more quietly. "He always gets that way when we pull off a bounty he has to track for a while." "Aye." "Know why?" Ashley asked in a hush. "Nay. Never found a good time to ask," Frost said as he opened the hatch and kicked both of the harnesses down to the crew members below. "We've got to get a better system for this," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. Elsewhere on the ship, Finn shook his head at a tiny compartment where several operating components were wedged in. It was like looking at an old 3-dimensional puzzle. Every key component of the inertial dampener systems was locked up in some box, or sealed in some piping, or built right between 2 parallel bulkheads, like this one. It took Finn half an hour of looking at how it was placed just to figure out his best route to access. He had seen tight systems before, but whoever had rebuilt that section of the dampers had one thing in mind: maximum effectiveness using minimal space. Word was that they had just finished chasing down a bounty, and it meant a payday for everyone. When and how much he hadn't asked yet, but since he had nothing to do with the capture, he wasn't expecting anything. His experience over the last couple of days had been eventful, interesting, so he had no reason to complain as far as he was concerned. He had been hired on by Frost, the first officer. What a character, with his accent, which sounded like an old Earth Irish accent he'd heard in movies. Hiring for the Samson wasn't exactly complicated. Frost checked for a criminal record, glimpsed at his educational transcript, and he was assigned to a repair post, then a bunk. His quarters consisted of a locker, a lower bunk with storage beneath it, and a trunk at the end of the bed. There were 6 people crammed into the small cabin, and a man to each. He was thankful that the fellow who slept above him, a large man who smelled like gear degreaser, worked on the opposite shift. He had only met him once while he was settling in. Having served on an ore hauler, Finn was used to a noisy ship, so the quiet of the Samson was a little unnerving. It was an ugly, heavily modified ship that looked more like an insect with its engine pods, the Max Jack grappler, and cargo train hookups at the back. He couldn't believe how well maintained the ship was on the inside. It was all unpainted decking and grating everywhere, with dim bioluminescent lighting to save power. Mechanically, he had never been on such a ship. There were 28 aboard, but he hadn't seen anyone for hours, not since he had started servicing the starboard inertial damper system. At first, he didn't understand how he could work on them while they were in hyperspace, but then he took a look at the electrical diagram. There were backups for the backups, so if he took something offline, another part of the system would compensate seamlessly. He finally figured out how to move the core inertial director he was working on. It was a bulky square component connected to secondary power in at least 3 ways. Half of its casing was removed already, so there was room for the modifications that had been made. Finn shook his head and crawled into the tiny workspace against the bulkhead, lying on one side with his arms over his head so he could fit and reach the component. As he had seen, it looked like if he moved the whole director box up, then away from him, down and forward, it should just pop right out. It took 4 tries. There was a latch behind that locked the whole component in place that he hadn't seen until he was under it. After that, it came right out into the hallway. It took him a few moments to extract himself from the cramped space, and then he just stood there looking at the part. What the hell happened to this thing? There's a reserve capacitor and God knows what else, he muttered to himself. Looks like Captain built a whole backup control circuit into it. Look there, it's a wireless receiver, Frost pointed out. He was chewing a greenish Forma meal bar. It's attached to a very old processing unit. Doesn't need much of a brain to relay commands, Frost said with a shrug. True. I have to admit it's ugly but ingenious. There's a primary and 2 backup systems built into this little unit, and I couldn't see it ever completely breaking down, said Finn. Then why is it out on the deck all in the open like? Oh, a status panel on the bridge said it was running hot by 14 degrees. That'd be the capacitor kit, built right up against the bottom of the casing, I'd imagine, said Frost. Yep. Finn carefully picked up the unit and turned it over so he could see the capacitor kit, a small, heavy box built right up against the inertial director unit. It was painted black at one point in time, but most of the paint had flaked and fallen off the casing. This thing looks older than I am. Probably is. Does it hold a charge? Frost asked. He scanned it and nodded. Enough to keep this unit powered for 5 or 6 days if the mains go out. I bet if I add a little insulation right between the director and capacitor casings, it'll stop overheating. Finn put the unit down, being careful not to disconnect any of the cables leading back into the crawlspace, and started to remove the capacitor casing. Does the captain modify a lot of the ship's systems? Frost laughed, nodding. He built this rig from a hull and a pile of parts in the cargo hold, if you believe the stories. I was an engineer for some military outfit. How long have you been aboard? Little over 3 years. Started as a gunner, Frost replied. What do you do now? Tactical. Not because I was the best gunner, but because I ran that Max Jack like no one has found. Those big clamps, right? Asked Finn. Well, it's part of it. There's also automated plasma cutters, pry arms, a fortified airlock, and other stuff you should just hope you never have to repair. Ever seen one work before? Nope, this is my first tour as a mercenary. All I know is that we go after people who are running away from the law or owe our clients credits. You mean lots of platinum? Well, credits, if he's got to take that. Anyway, Captain doesn't go after debts under 100,000 in the right currency, unless he gets to keep whatever he finds. Bounties, since I've been aboard, are mostly for serious crime, and we do almost anything else a ship this class does. He's no slaver, mind you. Anyway, a Max Jack grapples onto another ship, and then uses cutters and that hardened airlock to bust through a door and make a new one. It's a hell of a show, a real pirate's dream, Frost said. Only way to get a hold of a proper manufactured one is to capture a military ship or a customs corvette with an attitude. So the captain installed this one himself. Was barely functioning then. Then I joined the crew and started tinkering. Now I can crack into near any ship we come across. No other Max Jack like it. Something to see in action. I could imagine. Did the captain build it himself? Nope. He said he got it from a scrapyard. He's made improvements, sure, but mostly he had to make sure the rest of this old cargo hauler could handle the stress and impact it goes through when the Max Jack is doing what it was made for, cracking hulls. This was a cargo hauler? Asked Finn. At some point in time, aye. It makes sense that you don't recognize it, though, with all the armor plating and extra maneuvering thrusters. Not to mention the rail cannons and EMP turret. Yup, there's nothing else like her. Customized past designation and rock hard. A lot like her captain, Frost said. He seems that way. How long has he had the ship? Last time someone asked him, he said he was hatched here. At first I didn't believe it. Since then, I've seen enough to know it's been a while. The ship is as much part of him as his right arm. No one knows it like him. No one could run her like him. Well, I can see he thought of my solution for this little problem. There's already insulation between the capacitor kit and the main director box. It's just been worn through, Finn said as he pulled off what was left of the gray-blue insulation pad. It just needed replacing. Well, if you're thinking like the captain while servicing his ship, it'll be hard to go wrong. You're doing better than the last man standing in your place already. What happened to him anyway? He bought a ship the captain picked up on a job, making his own way somewhere now. Didn't take long. He only lasted 5 months. Pretty normal for repair crews to go through members, though, said Frost. Well, if the whole ship's like this, then I could see why. Without the proper training, someone couldn't last at this. Everything's done a certain way. It's all made to work a long time. Bad workmanship shows when the captain knows his tech. Yup. Last chief engineer we had discovered that the hard way. Haven't had an official replacement since. What happened? Finn asked, as he started putting the whole inertial director back together. Well, that's a sore point with some of the crew, so you'll have to keep this to yourself. His name was Nocula. Good fella, really smart. He was lazy, though, and kept the repair crews running hard so he didn't have to get his hands dirty. There was just one recovery that almost went bad. I took a lot of hits from this ship that thought it could get away from us because it had an arc gun and a beam or two. We got 'em anyway, but got shaken up real good. Lost a couple of repair guys and a lot of grunts. Only way to get the ship back in shape was to get everyone in on the repairs, Nocula included. I remember it like yesterday. A whole section of our main starboard power relay was hit. You can still see it if you look. I think I did. That whole section of the inner hull is a different color. Aye, you had me and Torres to thank for that. We patched that hole. We couldn't run the new cables for power, though. I might have a pretty good idea of how that stuff works, but I'm no specialist. So Nocula had to do it. Well, he rushed through so he could move on to the next job and was just finishing up. He added a few power distributors to the circuits so he didn't have to manually hardwire any of the main lines, knowing that he would be short on other work that needed doing closer to the engines. One of the repair guys, well, this one was a lass, called him on it when she saw what he was doing. She knew that without those power distributors, a part of the engine would have to be wired without a backup line or safeties. Finn shook his head and whistled. Wow, one thing goes wrong, and you could start a fire or blow a whole line of thrusters. Right? So Nocula passes her off and tells her to keep her nose out of his business. She stomps off, pissed like it was all personal, and just stops dead as she rounds the corner. There's Captain, standing right within earshot. She can't move. He's fuming. Oh, crap. He didn't hear the whole thing, did he? He musta. He just politely as pie steps around her and walks right up beside Nocula. He looks over the mess he's made and just asks, "Do we have more distributors?" Then Chief tells him, "I'll get them from somewhere, Captain." Captain looks over to the repair girl. I think her name was Limerick, real nice young thing, and asks, "Do we have any more in ship stores?" And she says we don't. Captain doesn't say anything. He just grabs Nocula by the collar and holds his ass down the hallway like some sack of meat. At one point, Captain pulled his gun so the Chief wasn't arguing until he saw the starboard airlock. I was standing right there, getting suited up for another trip out to help with patching the hull, and Captain tells me, "Open it." I'm not daft enough to argue when he's got his gun out, so I do, and in goes Nocula. Captain closes the inner door and shoots the controls, and then says, "If you can fix this from in there and let yourself back in, I'll let you stay aboard until we get to the next port." Well, Nocula just stared for a minute, and then he opened the control panel on his side. He must have been more rattled than anyone, though, because the next thing we see is this spark from our side of the controls, and the outer doors open. Sucked him right out into space. No helmet, nothing. Guy wasn't even smart enough to strap himself in or get into an emergency suit. "You're kidding," said Finn. "Nope. Nocula's probably still drifting around out there," Frost said, slowly running his hand through the air as though it were floating through space. "I've heard of people getting spaced before, but I've never met someone who actually did it." "Well, that's our captain. He doesn't lose his temper often, but lazy cusses like Noki and folk who endanger the ship will send him over the edge every time," said Frost. "Has he done it to anyone else?" Finn asked in a whisper. "He hasn't had to. Everyone knows what happened to Noki. He's left people in port before if they can't follow the ways of the ship, sure, but that's different. You've still got air, just somewhere, and you can probably find another crew to sign with." Finn looked at the inertial director, double-checking his workmanship. "Hey, look at that. It looks exactly like it did when you found it, only newer," Frost said, as he picked up a mechanical scanner and checked it. "Temperature's down 24 degrees. Looks like I did a hell of a job." "I just matched what the captain did before." "You'll do just fine, as long as you keep doing everything that way." "I'll see you around, kid. Captain probably wants me on the bridge," Frost said, as he handed the small scanner tool and then the wrapper from his generic formabar to Finn. Frost wiped his hands off on the back of his loose-fitting vac suit and rounded a corner, nearly bumping into Captain Valance. The lighting was always a little dim, as though to hide the bare cables and piping along the walls. The panels that were made to keep them out of sight were long gone, whether as a result of some kind of damage or because they caused a major inconvenience during repair. No one but the captain knew. He nodded at Frost, who had fallen in step at his left-hand side. "Nocula story again?" "Yup. Kid's eyes were the size of pie plates by the end." "You know, I really thought he'd be able to find his way in, even if he had to suit up, go outside, and come in through a working hatch." "I hear you, but it's still a good story to tell the newbies. Keeps him in line right from the start."